Started. So it's great to be back here talking about SharePoint adoption and business value. This is going to be an extension of a session we did last year in Anaheim. Just a quick poll of folks. Who actually was able to make it to that session last year? So a few people. Also, who works in the area of SharePoint planning, strategy, architecture, that sort of thing? I guess that's why you're all here, so that's pretty much everybody. That's awesome. And who has been to other sessions on the topic of adoption or business value, governance? So it's pretty well covered. I think it's great that we now have, I think, more of a business track that covers a lot of these topics. So this is going to be probably a little bit different than that. We're going to go pretty fast. I've got a lot of material to cover. I might actually not get to all of it. As you know, you can download the decks and you can contact me, and we can follow up in terms of some of the material. So it's a little bit aggressive in terms of some of the stuff I put in here. So basically, we're going to take what we did last year and we're going to jack it up a few notches. So hopefully this will bring value to you. Just give you a little bit of information about myself. I'm with Microsoft Services. I'm in an enterprise strategy group there. And we have a team that focuses on kind of the business white space of technology called the Business Strategy Consulting Team. And I've been a member of that team going on 7 years, believe it or not. And there's a couple familiar faces in the room here who I've actually worked with as customers, so it's great. You can see kind of your, not your company, but your industry listed over on the right side of this diagram. So one of the things that's been great for me is to actually have a perspective across a lot of different companies. I tend to go in for anywhere between a week and a month, and in a couple cases, a year or two for customers. But I've worked with just on a lot of different things for a lot of different customers, and you can actually see in this kind of strange diagram at the bottom of this thing some of the areas that I focus in. So. Enterprise information management is an area that I'm actually one of the worldwide architecture leads now at Microsoft for. It's an area that our customers are increasingly interested in. Envisioning SharePoint service architecture, social strategy, information architecture, business case development, change management, a lot of capability modeling, a lot of work with helping customers develop personas and information worker scenarios, all these sorts of things. So kind of, one foot in the technology door and kind of one more over on the business side. So it's kind of a nuance in terms of what we do relative to more the technical consulting side of the house. But certainly, it's been an interesting ride. We get to cover a lot of interesting areas. So you guys don't think I'm too boring. This is kind of what keeps me working. And especially the one at the top, he's one of the reasons I have to keep my job, and you guys have to rate the session well because I still have to pay for him for a while. He's only a sophomore, and hopefully by the time he gets out of school, he'll be funding me, and you can rate me any way you'd like. So that's that. Okay, so objectives of today's session. We're going to start by talking about a strategic approach to SharePoint adoption and value realization. And I really want to focus on that term strategic approach because there's a lot of great, what I would call more tactical approaches to adoption. And this is going to be thinking really big picture, even going into the enterprise architecture space. So really, these are things, if you're not a CIO, but you talk to your CIOs about kind of some of the big picture things to think about, you'll certainly have some tools in here that you can bring home to your organizations, especially at the end. I hope we get to the end because that's where I do provide some thinking on the years ahead. The business white space fundamentals part of this is basically going to be a quick review just to flash through what we talked about at the SharePoint Conference last year, where we're just going to baseline some of that stuff, and then we're going to move on from it to what is, I think, really the focus of this session, which is the third item here, where product evolution meets context evolution, what changes. So this came out of just working with customers and saying, all right, well, are we still doing change management and adoption the same way? What does consumerization of IT and social, bring your own device, the cloud, the economic conditions, do these things change how we should be thinking about this? And I don't think there's any real right or wrong answer to this. It's just, I think it's an interesting question. And so what we did is we actually went out and we polled our international community of architects and customers and consultants, what have you, and asked them a series of questions. We're actually going to read that data back to you today in the context of a few hypotheses about what we think could be the impact of some of these things on adoption and change management and how you address that in your organization. So, and then considerations for the year ahead will be doing, basically a menu of things to look at if you're not looking at them already. So, in terms of the journey I'm going to take you on, this is kind of a silly little diagram, but we're gonna basically start off in this land called Stratadel in this world of Spadoptia, and we're going to take a look at some of the pillars of adoption. We're going to look at what we did last year. We're going to review some of the things that some of our esteemed wise elders in the field have told us, and then we're going to revisit what the strategy is for the year ahead. So let's start off on the strategy side. So thinking about a strategic approach to SharePoint adoption and business value realization, there's a number of inputs that go into that. And I know there's been some great strategy sessions that I saw by Richard Harbridge, I think it is. He may even be here. Richard, are you here? Keep me honest. What's really interesting to see is really how far the notion of SharePoint strategy has come along. But when I think about it in terms of, you first have to understand your users, what your business and your technical needs are, what your other workload strategies might be. So do you have a social strategy? Do you have a collaboration strategy? Do you have these things that exist above the product level? So does your organization have those things, and should you be aligning with those things? Obviously, technical architecture, information architecture and management is a very important thing. I would say that's the one thing that I hadn't really done a lot of work in as of last year when I did this session, and the last years, in the last 12 months, it's been probably at least, probably 50 to 60% of what I've been involved in. Also thinking about it in terms of service architecture as your workloads expand, as you start going from collaboration into social, into portal, and what have you. What does that do to your service offerings? How does that work organizationally? How do you need to think about that? Obviously, another key input is going to be SharePoint capabilities, whether you're on 2007 or 10 or 13 and beyond. Those obviously are going to affect how you think about how you're going to approach a space. Governance and compliance. CMT&C is my term for change management, training, and communications, and thinking about how to use change management to impact behavior change, which is really what we're trying to do here, and then how that translates into value. Saw a great session yesterday by a gentleman over here on centers of excellence, and I think certainly in terms of your strategy, think about things like establishing communities of practice, that's a COP, using your community, using centers of excellence and that sort of thing. So I want to contrast really quickly to what I would consider to be more of a non-strategic approach, just to kind of hit some of these points home. So if you're focusing on adoption, training, and feature use only, it's great, because some people don't even do that. But that's not really what we're talking about here. There's a lot of great sessions, a lot of great information that Microsoft provides and other people in that area, and it's very important. It's just we're talking a little bit at a level kind of above that, but inclusive of that as well. A non-strategic approach to SharePoint is where you're not really aligning what you're doing with SharePoint with your organizational priorities. And you don't understand what your user types and needs are and how those might differ by business unit if you're a large organization. And if you only have a technical orientation, that's been mentioned in the number of the other sessions. And then workloads, if you don't have workload strategy alignment, so what are you trying to do from a collaboration or knowledge management or social perspective in the bigger picture, and are you aligning with that? And then static thinking, and that's really the thing that this is all about, is really trying to evolve the thinking in this space, not necessarily give you the prescription to move forward because there's only one answer, but really try to evolve the thinking and incorporate some of the things and the dynamics that are happening out there. So it's really basically saying, let's take a strategic look at this, let's put strategy at the forefront, and then kind of mesh that with what you're doing from a tactical perspective, and incorporate that into the overall life cycle of your SharePoint program. So we're going to quickly list a couple of the other sessions that I thought were fantastic and very complementary to what we're talking about here. Some people get a little bit confused when they say, okay, well, this guy talked about strategy, and you talked about strategy too, and that guy talked about adoption, but had a slightly different take on it. I would say listen to it all, pick the bits and pieces out that you think are useful for your context, and think of it as these are just additional tools to put in your toolbox. And we'll certainly be giving you some tools here today. So I'm going to blow this out. So the boxes across the top here are kind of the essence of this. So when you have new things from SharePoint, like you're getting with SharePoint 13, when you have the influence of people bringing their own devices and social computing, I would say the maturing of cloud-based solutions and organizations starting to embrace cloud, the fact that information workers are no longer the older ones aren't the Luddites that we used to characterize them as. They're getting a little bit smarter in terms of the use of technology. It's not 1998 or 2003 or 5 or 7 anymore, right? You see a maturing of the ability of your worker population to actually use electronic tools for collaboration and communication. And that changes things, right? Because if you're taking an approach like everybody's clueless and we got to train, we got to hold everyone's hands still, I think you're maybe kind of missing the mark. And so part of my hypothesis is that the treatment, as these people kind of evolve over time, that the treatment should evolve as well. And obviously, younger workforce relative to years past. The other dynamic is, I think, lean business and IT. So we would like to do a lot of things in a perfect world to enable our end users, but do we have the resources? Are we going to get the perfect change management program funded, or are we going to have to think about lean ways to do it? I certainly think that could have an impact on how we approach this space, how we do SharePoint strategy. I also think that when someone says, well, adoption is all about business alignment, and I say, well, yeah, that's a platitude, and a lot of the other sessions have talked about platitudes. We've known that for a long time. People have been talking about business IT alignment for a long time. I think that's actually evolved. I think that people are getting better at providing self-service IT, and I think that will certainly impact kind of how you approach this space. And then the final one is more of a user experience focus, certainly in the product itself, in the out-of-the-box version of SharePoint. We've, I think, made great strides in terms of making it more user-focused, easier to use, but also creating a better understanding of your end users in the programs that you're trying to roll out to them, and then evolving your change management accordingly. There we go. So a couple of the, in terms of impacts, these things might impact some of the key questions we're going after. Does a convergence of these factors change the approach? Does adoption get harder or easier? And if it's getting harder, how should we mitigate it? Change management, does the emphasis shift further towards the front end of the life cycle? So should we be thinking more in terms of really doing a lot of upfront strategic planning? Should we be then maybe some of the more costly stuff that's more hands-on, backing off a little bit of that and moving it up into the planning and coming up with automated tools to facilitate the change management? And then the other thing is, people are talking about, well, okay, so deployment isn't what you're going after, it's adoption, it's behavior change. But how do you really measure behavior change and business change? I think that's a key question as well. So we're going to come back to this. So let's rewind and talk about last year. So we're going to baseline some of the things that we covered in last year's SharePoint 266. So very similar, where I presented a SharePoint planning and adoption framework, roadmap to value. I know a couple of customers saw this, and actually, along with the paper that went along with it that I can make available to you, have used it to actually kind of construct a sort of their program that they went and kind of implemented over the following year. So that was actually very flattering to hear that. And I think one of the people who did that is in the audience. So these are kind of some of the topics we covered. I'm going to go through them really quickly. So we started off on talking about some of the data on adoption. This is from the CIO Executive Board, where they talked about some of the major impacts. We talked about how to kind of develop a strategic approach and strategy tables and strategy roadmaps and how those might work. Somewhat, I would say, novel or kind of new thinking around trying to understand end user needs. This isn't really very easy when you're trying to say, hey, we want to go, and this customer, the customer that this is based on was going to SharePoint 2010. And there's like 5 times as many things you could do with 2010, and the question was, well, should we do all of them? Do we have requirements for these things? Or are we just we're going to provide them just because they're available? And so, some approaches for that. We covered, how you go about doing that. And then translating those needs into service offerings and a service architecture. And I think the service architecture thing is really important. We talked about it a lot last year. I'll give it about 5 more seconds, and that's that depending on the workloads you're trying to provide and your organizational structure, it may be that you need to split yourself into technical and business service providers and think about actually providing a core service to other providers within your organization who would bring it out to the end users. So for example, if I want to provide a BI solution, and I've got a BI team that already basically provides that front end, that kind of, a door to knock on to get BI stuff, maybe they're the better group to be the ones who reuse the infrastructure that I provide them. And so that's the service architecture kind of addresses those opportunities. This is just an example of one for a fictitious company, but it's based on, I'd say the real world from what I've seen out there. So we covered that. Business case, this is kind of something I always like to think of, is you have to go from at the bottom where you've got your products or your services, and then technical capabilities which enable people to use that stuff as part of different scenarios that then you can align up with business capabilities and then business performance. And again, that's not an easy thing to do either. So one of the things we've done with customers all over the world is actually kind of work this from bottom to top as part of doing business cases. So, and this is an example where we go back to that service architecture diagram and think about the value that's provided to customers through a service, a business service that you offer. And actually, you could actually have an exchange or services between the tiers in your service architecture, and that could be pertinent to your business case as well. Then finally, with change management, training and communications, this is a model that we presented that I've used for a couple customers. Just kind of a big picture. You can tell I like diagrams. I hope you guys like diagrams, because we have a lot of diagrams. And then this is basically takes it starting from the top. This is for a large global chemical company who was rolling out a bunch of basically a Wave 2010 rollout. And so what they were looking at is what are the change management and training communications required given this portfolio of things we want to roll out. The middle tier in this diagram is essentially their different audiences and profiles and personas. And then the bottom is actually delivery mediums for everything from awareness and promotions to training and self-help and in support and everything else. So that was another technique we talked about last year. And then moving into governance, where we presented what I call a governance architecture model. Thinking about how you should split yourself into thinking about governance of technology versus governance of content, and then having different views of governance. This is actually a process view across the content and technology tiers of that framework. And then finally, measurement. There's been some great stuff on measurement here at the conference. This is just a real quick flash through it. I won't attempt to spend too much time on it, but certainly that's another important aspect of the overall framework. So, that was that took us an hour and 15 minutes actually in the session last year, and hopefully less than 10 minutes there. So now we're going to go to the land customer shire. So what happened in the last year for me personally in terms of things that, or me and my group were asked to go in and do for customers. And I looked at this and I said, so the dotted lines are kind of around a couple of different clusters. So one is, I would say capability, so SharePoint strategy and envisioning, SharePoint capability and maturity modeling certainly is something that came up. We're going to show some of this stuff at the end, and some of the tools that we use that can make available. Collaboration strategy, also thinking in terms of an IW capability lifecycle model. So this is way above SharePoint in the architecture, but thinking about all the capabilities that you have, whether it's mobility, collaboration, knowledge management, devices, all that stuff all mixed in. What are the strategies for each one of those different domains? How do they map to your user needs? How do those things align with what you're trying to do from a business perspective? What does that mean in terms of programs of change you should be thinking about on the long term? So this definitely gets into the enterprise architecture space, and it's been a lot of what I've been doing. On the bottom of the diagram, bottom left, you'll see information management, information architecture, ECM. A lot of customers are looking at, even in the 2010 era, we're saying, gosh, there's so much stuff, where do I start? We don't have a taxonomy. Should we do managed metadata? How should we do managed metadata? So a lot of work in that area. And so we did workshops and did all this other stuff. Social computing is a big thing. It continues to be. SharePoint is a development platform. That's this thing over here called SpotUp. Establishing SharePoint as a service. And then SharePoint governance. So these are all kind of areas that were very, I would say, front and center. So like, again, I think I said at the beginning, I'm going to give you just data from work that we do in terms of the things that I'm seeing customers ask for. And so overall observations, I would say that customers are expanding their workloads for sure as they become more mature in their SharePoint environments. More of a focus on end users, organizational capability. Consumerization IT has been a huge thing. People taking capability views and maturity modeling, focus on enterprise information management, service orientation, obviously cloud, and then social. Then along comes SharePoint 13, and this is just the diagram we have that kind of puts all that into a nutshell. It's hard to find these things, by the way. Like, how would I describe, what's in 13 in one page, right? So this doesn't have any pictures of really good-looking people staring at computers or anything, and it's just really kind of bottom line for me. And so this allows me to kind of say, well, from an adoption standpoint, which of these boxes might actually really stand out in terms of their impact on adoption and getting value? And so certainly user experience, certainly mobile, certainly social. Really all these things in their own way could contribute to adoptability of the platform. So moving into the hypothesis space. So we wanted to look at, okay, so for new SharePoint capabilities, that they make it easier for business users to provision and use SharePoint across multiple workloads, enable IT to more efficiently run their SharePoint infrastructure. Impact the device. I'm just going to focus on these red boxes and kind of fly through these things. So users expect things to be easily accessible and just work without training, like on their consumer apps and devices. Would you guys say that that's necessarily true in your organizations nowadays? Getting a little bit more like that? They don't want to pick up a manual to learn how to use SharePoint. Anybody? Anybody? Okay, heads nodding. Again, impact of cloud alternatives. So one of the things I think about when I think about Office 365 in the cloud is that it's going to provide you faster time to market for new capabilities and thereby shortening your time to value. That's a big thing. If you get SharePoint 13 and it's going to take you 2 years to get those capabilities out to your end users on premise, that's a big gap in terms of value. So the cloud definitely will have an impact. There'll also be things that will only be available in the version of SharePoint as it's evolving much quicker on a quarterly release schedule. So that will have some impact. So again, these are hypotheses, and we're going to validate them with data in a second. Again, adoption and training strategies from 10 years ago no longer apply. We need to rethink what's necessary for the desired outcome. From the point of view of lean business and IT, challenging business conditions and the constant push for savings dictate new approaches to adoption and change management. What do you guys think on that one? Agree? Got to do things a little bit leaner now? Okay. Business-aligned self-service IT. So end users increasingly expect to get everything via self-service mechanisms, reducing hands-on treatment. but increasing potentially the need for upfront planning. Then the final one, so user experience focus and evolved change management. So more of the kind of mechanical approaches to change management, helping people figure out how to use stuff continue, but they diminish in importance as the user interface and user experience gets better, and change management's efforts step up their focus on behavioral change and business outcomes. So this is one where I think I got the most, and so we'll look at the data, you'll see some of the statements that we got. This becomes very controversial. So if you're talking to a change management person and you say that, and I've actually said it to the people, I say, as the services and the devices and the software and the maturity of your information users, information workers increases, change management should trend towards zero. And I'm ProSci certified, I do change management all the time, but it's blasphemy for a change management person to say that. I'm not saying it's ever going to happen, but it should trend downwards, because this takes work for your organization to do these sorts of things. So people generally don't like this statement, but I throw it in there almost to just, actually this is the thing I think that got a lot of people to respond to my survey around the world, because they didn't like this statement at all. So again, these are hypotheses. Okay, so now this is the survey we did. So this went out to a worldwide community of customer-facing consultants, architects, et cetera. And so we threw out these thesis statements to be somewhat provocative, and we got back. We got 25 what I would consider to be material responses, and which addressed most of the hypothesis areas. And then there was a lively discussion ensued that ended up being about 25 pages of just stuff. And what I did was I said, okay, what are some of the top themes in here that I could read back to this audience? So the first one is in the area of impact of new capabilities. And so there's a lot of stuff here. I'm not going to read through each one of these, but when you get the deck, take a look at it. I think that some of these things are interesting because they surface, I think, so. And so like if somebody said, well, if a marketing person comes in and says, SharePoint 13 is going to make adoption super easy. And I mean, I think that might be true, but I'm not sure that that's not necessarily value add for the purposes of this exercise. What I tried to pull out or surface from some of this data was actual statements of people from work with customers where they had some evidence of this. So I thought, so what you're going to see here in these slides again is, some of these things I've surfaced. So in the area of value, a number of people felt very strongly that to really measure value, you have to think about it from the personal level. So how are you measuring it in terms of change to the individual? And so you have to understand who you're trying to impact. Yes, question?
So what level in the organization were people that responded to the survey?
Oh, which level? This was internal at Microsoft. So these are all people who are, Microsoft people who are, probably have, I would say, 20 to 30 years experience. So they're very senior, highest level architects around the world. And this represents their customer. So I was asking for not just their opinion, but actual, what are your customers saying? What are your customers asking you for? What are the trends you're seeing in your customer organizations? So it's by no means a scientific study, but I think it's interesting from an anecdote standpoint. There's a couple things in here I think are actually certainly interesting. Like measuring impact at the business unit level, I think is, you have to come up with a measurement strategy. There's other sessions have talked about that. But it's, I have to think about it from an overall program level. I have to think about it from business unit level. I have to think about it at a personal level. And so here's our friend change management. A couple kind of the key things is that, and this is, so to kind of refute my statement from before, so there was evidence from a number of the responses that change management is rising in importance with the increased emphasis on the front end strategy and planning to adapt the tactics to these new dynamics that we're talking about. The bottom left one is from a bank in the UK. I thought was interesting, where they were on their second or third generation of SharePoint, and they realized they needed to do more change management because the first two efforts at it really kind of failed. They need to do better next time. So that was interesting. And then the other thing was that traditional training may not actually be required in some cases. but that high touch might be required when you're really trying to enforce behavioral change. So there's a lot of dynamics in this. I think there's a lot of things to think about. I think it's somewhat amorphous, but I think that there could be some things that surface out of here that might be useful for you. Some of them are things that you probably already know about. Business alignment. I thought the one at the top here, top middle, was kind of interesting, that CIOs are challenged to solicit business needs and actually have the resources to do something about it. And I've actually seen that in a couple of organizations. They say, well, if we go out and we ask the business what they want, then we might actually have to deliver something. And which I thought was kind of interesting. And there's some other sorts of things that surface as part of this one. User focus and experience. One of the areas I'm actually working on now, I'm actually doing this for a computer manufacturer, is we're doing user data segmentation and clustering, and looking at, from a population of 110,000 people, where people kind of fall into different persona categories. So that's been certainly interesting. I see a lot of customers asking for that. So the understanding of users and needs is critical for planning rollout and continuous improvement and measurement. Other themes that kind of came up, consumerization IT. This is actually an interesting one. So test the assumptions about consumer trends impact and millennial workforce needs. One of the responders said that when they actually surveyed their younger population, they weren't actually that interested in having a complete suite of social computing capabilities. And I've seen a couple other studies out of, I forget the guys, I think it was Blackwell out of the UK, had a study that said, some of our assumptions about people who are older not really getting social computing, and that all the younger people actually are demanding it, is not necessarily always the case. So test those assumptions. I thought that was really interesting. Staying ahead by anticipating what's next. I've heard a lot of IT departments get caught off guard in the last year by this whole consumerization of IT thing. And at first, if it was just the lower people in the organization asking for it, it'd be one thing. But it typically starts with executives saying, I need to bring my iPad into work. I need to bring, well, I should say Surface, right? But whatever the device is. So that's certainly something to think about. Actually, I want to go back to that last point. So viral adoption trends. If anybody went to any of the Yammer sessions, I think that they've done a really good job of really promoting viral adoption of their application. And I think that's certainly something that could really be important moving forward. There's a lot of techniques out there to do that. So harder or easier? I think in general, from the data I saw, that people are saying, hey, adoption should actually get easier. I think the role of cloud, there's a couple interesting points made there. The role of the CIO, I think is one point I kind of liked was to drive innovation and continuous improvement in the adoption space and really partner with the business. And then one thing this is the closest thing you'll get to a plug from me, that the enterprise strategy program that Microsoft has provides tools for understanding business and your people, place, and technology, and translating those into strategy, architecture, and value. So that's another thing to consider, is that we actually have services at Microsoft who can help customers in this area. And there's some other things that I think are kind of more probably things you've heard before, but I'll just click through those so you can go back to the decks and notes. So back to our questions. So I would say that for the high-level hypotheses around capabilities, devices, cloud, and et cetera, I think we affirmed through the data that all of these things do have an impact. The only place where I still think it's true, we didn't get any responses on it, was around lean business and IT. That didn't seem to show up in any of the survey responses. So I would say that this convergence of factors does change your approach, that adoption gets easier, and there's certain things you can do to make sure that it does get easier. But understanding your people, how they work, and what sort of change management strategies map to those. Then change management does change, and to really understand what's happening from a business change standpoint, you need to study the impact on user scenarios at a business unit level. So let's take a look. We're back in our our land of Stratadale here. Let's take a look at the year ahead. So this is remember I talked about this thing called an information worker capability model. That's a green box in Miller's diagram. So one of the things I strongly recommend that folks do is develop an understanding of their information worker capability architecture and sustainability models. So this is just a pretty high-level picture, believe it or not, of that. So starting with your information worker capability and productivity, you have different capability strategies aligned with business capabilities, business performance, future state capabilities, gap analysis, et cetera, and so forth. This kind of gives you, on a page, a feeling for how you might try to look at this in the big picture. People who are typically just down at the SharePoint level might not be interested in this, but certainly this is something I think that you certainly want to align with and be part of. And I've actually versions of this picture that has SharePoint capability model in it. It eventually fits in. So the second thing is to develop strategies for key information worker. C3SC is a term I use for communication, collaboration, content, and social computing. And that kind of maps to, I think, the way Gartner looks at the same space. And I think it's important to develop strategies for those capability domains as aligned with IT, enterprise architecture, and the business. So this orange box is basically a future state vision and strategy in a broad sense for one of these areas. So it could be collaboration, it could be social, it could be mobility. But I really think that it's important to have strategies for these areas so that when you go and say, well, what should we do with SharePoint? Well, it should align with something at a higher level, and that's what this is. And so then when you get down to the SharePoint level, also have a SharePoint strategy. And so this basically is a diagram that kind of shows how you might go after that, where you look at on the bottom left your current run state from an IT architecture standpoint, from a business standpoint, kind of linking all those things together. So that's another thing I think that's important for folks to consider doing. This third is to develop a better understanding of your people and the work they do. This is actually an excerpt that shows a partial list of the profile cards that Microsoft has from a study of its information worker customers across the world. Just one way of showing it. It doesn't have any necessarily proprietary data or anything, and it's just saying you can segment your people in these horizontal work style segments, give them names, give them, put quotes in there, little things that kind of help you figure out, okay, well, what's the difference between providing capabilities for an all-star versus somebody who sits in a cube in the same desk every day versus a road warrior who never comes into the office, who's completely mobile, often at customer sites and that sort of thing. So certainly I think that's an important thing to consider. Back to the service architecture thing, it's something I'm passionate about. I would say I don't see customers doing enough of, is to develop, if you haven't done it already, develop out a service architecture and service offerings mapping to your end user needs. Invest in value modeling and measurement, and I don't think the value question goes away. People are going to be asking about it. It's a hard thing to do when you have kind of the world's your oyster with a platform like SharePoint. You can do a lot of different things with it, so you really have to think about it in terms of scenarios. Develop a change management strategy and start executing. And then this is another area. So if you're looking at this list on the left, these are areas in the last year that I've developed or kind of modified or evolved capability models for. And so this is actually a capability maturity model. So if you've ever seen Microsoft's models in this area, you see basic, standardized, dynamic, rationalized, dynamic. And then this actually, the columns are dimensions. So if you're going to try to say, what's my, what is a maturity, what does a maturity model for SharePoint look like? Well, the dimensions that I like to use are architecture and infrastructure, collaboration, people and community, search, ECM, portals, et cetera. And then you can basically put yourself in kind of where you sit in that and say, well, where do I want to go? Do I want to do all these things at the same time? Is where we are today fine? I mean, that's another thing. It's like the presumption that you always have to go to a higher level of maturity, I think is something that should be questioned. But these things I think are very handy. And I think they're useful in other. So somebody might say, well, we really want to focus on enterprise information management or information architecture or ECM, and there's specialized models that focus more in those areas and provide kind of a drill down. Additional recommendations. I think that in terms of thinking about Office 365, usually the first things to go are some of the more some of the utility workloads. I just in talking to folks today, I found out about things that are coming up on Office 365 that I don't think were there, 3 months ago. And so I think because they're evolving that so quickly, there could be some really interesting things to kind of track that are worth investigating. I think that starting to build Azure apps coupled with on-prem and Office 365 SharePoint is certainly an interesting opportunity area. Look at your future service needs and organizational models and work those into your strategies. So, and then stepping up communication and marketing of services. So we talk about the service offerings and how you bring those out to people. To the session yesterday on centers of excellence, I think stepping up your efforts in the area of business alignment and providing a center of excellence and thinking about how you're going to design that. And then developing and executing against a governance strategy, balancing control and end user needs. So this is kind of the things I think that folks should be thinking about moving forward. And with that, please fill out your evaluation forms. And I know there's probably lots of questions because I flew through that. How fast did I do that? Okay, we have like 30 minutes left. Wow. Wasn't expecting to go through it that fast. So there must be questions. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. So I love this question because I'm working on a project right now for a customer in this area, and it's of course I'm consultant. I'm going to say it depends, right? But when we looked at developing what we call horizontal or work style based personas, so they're not necessarily aligned with a business unit or a role. They're more like based on a set of parameters around use of productivity tools, who you collaborate with. And then your kind of location flexibility and mobility profiles. And those ended up I think there were, when we looked at our international user base, the way the segmentation came out was 5 or 6. So, and actually 5 or 6 are a lot easier to deal with than 15. I've seen customers do that. But it all really depends on what you want to use them for. So if you want to use, some people use them for a rollout. They might use them for their strategy. They're thinking, okay, well, we need to address the needs of this particular part of our user base. They might use it for a business case. They might use it for change management, what have you. I mean, so many different uses, and that's the thing that the first 2 things I talk to customers about in this area are, what do you want to use this for, and what sort of data do you have that we could reuse before we get started on it? So that's kind of a long answer, but it's usually, I would say 4 or 5 is easier, but I've seen it as high as 15, and so if I give people a range, I'll say 5 to 15.
Last year, you were definitely pretty passionate about SharePoint offered as a service.
Right.
Organization.
Yep.
So it really be a 2-part question. The first part, why do you feel it adds value to the organization? And the second one is, what are the key things to be that successful?
That's a great question. I guess I did spend some more time on that. Yeah, so I just touched on it really briefly. I think that the thing that really woke me up to providing SharePoint as a service was, there was a Burton paper on providing, basically providing SharePoint as a service that was like an ITIL type. So they kind of referred to ITIL, and they said, to really align with and make sure it's aligned with the business, and to make sure it's governed, and to make sure that you've got the communication of what's available to people. So as a business user, I can go in and I can view a catalog. I can find out how much it costs. There are people who can answer the phone. There might be a consulting function. All those things kind of go into place when you think about it as a service, that there's some front end to it, as opposed to being just a technical capability. And a lot of people are probably they're providing some aspects of SharePoint as a service, I would say already, but they're maybe by defining it and kind of setting goals for it, that they can maybe make it more mature and really, I think, align with industry standards in that area.
My personal experience working with a lot of clients is that SharePoint is woefully understaffed.
Right. Yeah.
And the people that have been tasked and wear so many different hats, and maybe the business side is not a skill of theirs.
Right.
So they're not a strategist.
Yep.
They don't know the business model of the organization. Key things that they're focused on. So it seems to me that as SharePoint as a service, you need to have basically it's an internal consulting organization that really
Yeah.
understands the business and thinks money and development.
Yeah, and it could be a whole bunch of different things. So if you remember on that service architecture diagram, there was the SharePoint services team at the bottom, who are kind of the people I think you're talking about, who only have so much bandwidth to be able to provide end user services. But they may also, depending on their level of automation and everything, be able to have a page that people can come to request a site. And there might be a business function that can basically, take the request for a site collection if it's not automatically provisioned, and basically deal with that from a queue perspective and get meet those needs. But then, and I think that sometimes that might work for collaboration, just for utility stuff. Once you start moving into some of these areas, I think that it could be that's when I think it really starts to you need to really start thinking about, well, okay, how would we actually provide how would we actually meet the business user needs with just a small team, right? And so you start thinking about concepts like the center of excellence is certainly, I think, one of the things that could be kind of live on that kind of front end, the customer-facing end. But there could also be consulting functions. And then you have to think, depending on your level of federation in your organization, well, do I want that to be a central IT function, or do I want to actually say, hey, IT is only going to provide this much, and then your business units it's up to you to establish your own front-end service to your end users. And so depending on that all those sorts of variables, you come up with a strategy for that. And so what I've done with a couple of customers is go just deliver a workshop on what is the concept behind SharePoint as a service, what are some of the considerations, and what are some of the value you could get out of it. It's just to kind of get it started. I mean, each one of these areas in here is like its own hour-long presentation. We just kind of flew through it, I understand, but I like to look at it like I like to blow it out like that, and then, depending on which area you're interested in, we can come back to it.
With your workshops, who are the level of people in the organization?
Yeah. So for SharePoint as a service, when I did this for a medical device manufacturer in the East Coast, they had their basically their SharePoint team. They had kind of a consulting function in the organization that would learn kind of what the hot new technologies were and provide some services. Those guys came. They had a business liaison function that came. So the business liaisons wanted to understand, because they were kind of the ones who provide the requirements on behalf of the business units. And so they had basically, I think, 10 major business units, and they had a liaison function from each one of those representing what the requirements would be. And so certainly want to have some of those folks in there. And then I think they had a few people from their architecture team as well. But that's, that was just them, but it's, it would vary. Right. Right, yeah.
And you need to go, my challenge was going above that to get the business model, the corporate strategy. So you guys need to come together. And it always ends up being IT and the
Yep.
They're the only ones who do both.
Right.
But they don't have the knowledge or weight or expertise or whatever it might be in order to make those two people talk.
Well, it's funny. There's a person in this room who we recently dealt with this problem where, in fact, I thought, in terms of how I approached it, I came in thinking we were going to do an information architecture and ECM workshop, which is more appropriate for people in IT who are running the team and thinking of evolving the SharePoint service forward. We ended up with more of a mixed audience, a lot of people from legal and people from enterprise architecture and security and some business liaison type functions along with the other folks. And so we really need to up-level the type of conversation we had with them and that's where we started talking more about information management, which is one of the reasons I formed our worldwide community in that area is you can have, I think, more of a business conversation when you're talking about information management than you can if you're talking about information architecture or ECM capabilities, for sure. And, but still, it's always going to be a problem to figure out who's going to show up for one of these things and who your sponsor is. And you know, often IT people are left holding the bag and not necessarily, because people are saying, oh, that's your area,